Okay, now we're going. All right, let me back up for the benefit of our viewers. This is the first session where of our Intertestamental Period seminar, where we're going to be talking about the wisdom of Solomon. I'm doing this as a Google Hangout at the request of some friends in California who wanted to be with us, but cannot be here in Corvallis, Oregon tonight. So we're going to do it virtually, and hopefully technology will not betray us, and not only will they be able to follow along what's happening, there will also be a recording of this section that they can then access later, and it will be posted on YouTube and all that sort of thing. And gradually, hopefully, we can start building up a series of presentations on this and see what happens with that. It sounds like only slightly less work than doing a podcast, so we'll see how this goes. The only problem is I only get one take. Although I am told that it's possible to edit these things after the fact. So no, it isn't. Well, okay. So what I want to do first of all, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping just to get things started. We are starting a new book, and I'm going to be receiving some commentaries that I've ordered in the mail soon. I'd like to hear from anyone who might be interested in following along in one of these and just kind of piping up whenever something interesting turns up. Also, if you happen to have a favorite translation, one that isn't quite mainstream, well, that's not quite the right word. Like, for instance, I would love to have someone follow along in the Jerusalem Bible. If someone has that, you've got that. Okay. If you see something interesting in the Jerusalem Bible, please holler. And there might be some other translations that would be of interest. Let me know, and let's keep this going and take advantage of this. At least some of the scholarship that's been devoted to this book for the last couple of thousand years. Now, so this will all develop as we move forward, and it will. It's gonna take some time. We'll hit our stride, and I think we'll end up with something rather interesting. So, what I want to talk about first of all is. Oh, come on. Oh, that's great. It lets me show the screen but not do anything with it. Okay. Let me change something here. Oh, what is that? The $100,000? No, that actually is my face. When I the thing is, when I untie my hair and shake it out, I bear an alarming resemblance to Benjamin Franklin. I mean, it's gotten it is to the point where street people would come up to me. You look like Benjamin Franklin. True story. So so I'm not sure what this little business is. That's pretty interesting. So let's try this again. Yeah, that's my face electronically placed on the $100 bill. And the fact that you had to ask tells you a little bit of just how goofy this all is. Okay. So no, that's not working either. Okay. So what we might have to do is just not screen share, and we'll just go to the slides, and I will try to explain the slides as best we can, and we can all contemplate on yet a little bit more of our lives that the internet has taken away and taken time that we'll never get back. So we're starting in a new genre of literature here that we haven't really talked about before in the intertestamental period, and that's wisdom literature. Now, wisdom literature is something that is found everywhere in the ancient Near East. It's known in pretty much every civilization: Egypt, Mesopotamia. There were Canaanite sages, and they all consist of the same kinds of things. There are sayings, there are proverbs, there are riddles, there are even some prayers that are intended to highlight the tension that comes from trying to do what you're supposed to do and things still don't work out, which of course is not what wisdom literature teaches. It teaches you that if you do the right thing, if you keep your nose clean and work hard and play by the rules, that things will work out for you. Of course, we have nothing like that in our civilization today, but it's really not a stretch to call wisdom literature ancient Near Eastern success literature, because that's really what it was. It's grounded in the problems of everyday life and deals with the world and human nature. So, and we have a lot of this literature that's been recovered, the extra biblical stuff. And as we go through the Wisdom of Solomon, we'll be kind of following a parallel track. I want to use this as an opportunity to introduce bits and pieces of this ancient literary tradition alongside it, so that we have a basis for comparison. Although, as you're going to see tonight, the comparison diverges pretty sharply from what we have in the Bible for a number of reasons. The Bible itself, anyway, going back to some of this extra biblical material, for instance, there are some Egyptian collections of proverbs that are almost word for word the same as a number of proverbs that we have in, well, Proverbs, the book of Proverbs. And some of them even occur in the same order. I mean, it's like something was just lifted and planted with a little bit of reworking so that you purge out the Egyptian gods and put in the Israelite God. But other than that, the changes are not really all that significant. We have the Bible itself making references to people like who are considered sages, Arab sages, Edomite sages, Job's three friends in quotes, who come to discuss his plight with him. They're all the hallmarks of Israelite sages. And I use the word sages as a technical term because it really is, in a sense, and we'll come to that in a moment. As a virtue, was believed to be perhaps the highest virtue that someone could aspire to or obtain. And it was not something that was so much as on the gift list of luck. You really had to go after it and go get it. So now this takes us to, here we go. This is what we've just been talking about. A couple of other points. There is a temptation to contrast or compare wisdom literature with Greek philosophy. And while there is some overlap in the sense that both were interested in how you conduct yourselves, wisdom literature really wasn't as concerned about the nature of the universe or how things worked. It was more about how to live your life in here and now. In experience, it wasn't terribly speculative about what may or may not be out there. And it was also something that was considered to be the right of people who were educated, like this Egyptian scribe here. Someone who was literate, had access to wisdom literature. They were able to take full advantage of it, even though there were some proverbs and sayings that did get passed down at pretty much all levels of society. the really good stuff, though, stayed with the elite, or at least they had more access to it than others would. Um, so, so what is wisdom literature? Well, in the Bible, we have Proverbs, Job, Jonah, and Ecclesiastes. There are some scholars who would put Song of Songs in that category. That may or may not work out. I'm really not too sure that that's the best way to do it. Song of Songs is a really odd job, and it's really hard to put in its category. It's going to be the category of its own. The idea of a proverb is something, as I said, we find all over the place. And the idea behind wisdom literature, like I said, you do the right thing, good things will happen to you. Ecclesiastes is highly critical of that, and Job, oh my gosh, I mean, Job goes after the whole wisdom thing with a baseball bat, and just completely demolishes the whole idea that bad things do not happen to good people. In fact, they do, and both books, both Job and Ecclesiastes, they both come to the conclusion that there is no suitable answer for this problem. The problem being of undeserved suffering, or maybe another way of putting it, the problem of retribution, which we will talk about in a little while. The wise person, the wise man, in the Israelite wisdom tradition, what they call the sage. Now, we don't talk about sages very often. We hear about priests and we hear about prophets, but the sage occupied a kind of in-between space where they weren't concerned with the priestly, and they weren't so much concerned with the prophetic, but they were concerned about how to live your life. And it was very different. It was a different niche. And we see the three segments of the intellectual tradition spelled out very neatly in Jeremiah 18:18, where he says, then they said, come and let us devise plans against Jeremiah. Surely the law is not going to be lost to the priest, nor counsel to the sage, nor the divine word to the prophet. Come on and let us strike at him with our tongue and let us give no heed to any of his words. So there's a whispering campaign that they're getting ready to launch in the full Jeremiah. But this is an important verse because it lists out those three people who were very important parts of the intellectual landscape. Now, Hebrew wisdom literature has some fairly specific things about it. It is a fairly late development, starting maybe around the early Iron Age, starting basically with Solomon, which isn't terribly late per se, but as a separate tradition, we really don't start seeing literature devoted to it for quite some time. Although we see hints of it in various other places. We see hints in the Psalms, we see hints, of course, in the Proverbs, because we don't know how old some of those are. And so on. It's very much tailored to the individual. Wisdom is very much not concerned with the community or who, with the people in general. It doesn't really have much to say about salvation or the acts of God, except that he doesn't seem to do what he's supposed to do. You don't see much about Jewish national identity or any of that sort of thing. Covenant, election, God acting in history, not much there. You really don't see it. It tends to be more cosmopolitan in its scope, more worldly, if that's the right word. It's very questioning, it's skeptical, it likes to ask the hard questions, but it does, it is very big on contemplating God's creation, as opposed to, say, going in and exploiting it or making use of it. This is also an important point. The proverb is the initial quantum of wisdom. It's how wisdom tends to be dispersed in Israelite tradition. Other people put more emphasis on riddles. We do have a couple of those in Israelite tradition. For example, Samson asks a riddle in Judges you don't see a lot of dialogue the way you do in the Greek sources, and the proverb eventually becomes the parable, and you really see that reaching its full expression at the time. The parable really is kind of an outgrowth of the wisdom tradition, not just because because of the timing, but because ultimately you're trying to convey certain ideas, and a two-line proverb just won't do it. You reach a point where things reach a certain depth and sophistication that you need a narrative in order to spell out what that wisdom is. So, so that's how we end up with this thing called the parable. Now, finally, we also cannot leave the subject without talking about wisdom personified, Sophia. Sophia is also Saint Sophia in the Orthodox Church. She's sometimes also referred to as godly wisdom. For some reason, she's female. She is beside God, although she isn't God herself. She existed in the beginning, apparently, according to Proverbs. She took part in the creation. You see some of this idea later where that, for example, in Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, you get a reflection of this when they talk about how before God created the world, He created the Torah with black fire on white fire. It's a very vivid image. And so before you can have creation, you have to have wisdom. Well, wisdom isn't just, neither a borrower nor a lender be. It's something a lot more profound than that. Yes?
The concept of wisdom brings to us to so complicated and so abstract that you have to make a person understand. Is that maybe why it becomes why they think a woman rather than man? That's another question.
Right. Okay, so the question is why go to the trouble of personifying? Why not personify, for instance, charity, maybe, or something like that? Maybe Sophia was, as you suggest, so deep and multifaceted that you can't just wrap it up in a single concept. He starts to take on a third dimension and even an existence of her own. I think one of the reasons for that is it's both an expression of the sophistication of it, but also an expression of the perceived importance of it. The idea being that without some kind of reason or grasp or knowledge, that creation simply could not be. Yeah.
They realize that they have
Okay, so that this satisfies the need for female in opposition or apposition to a male, right? Yeah, that could be as well. Sorry, in balance with each other. The other thing too that is important to remember is that it's almost certain, I think. Well, it is certain that God in the Old Testament was believed by many Israelites to have a female counterpart and a female consort. In fact, we even have graffiti on prayers to this effect. There are two inscriptions in particular, one at a place called Katilat Ajrud and another at a place called Kirbet El Kom, where we find prayers written to Yahweh and his Asherah. The Asherah was a Canaanite female goddess. It's also the name of an object of worship that is mentioned in the Bible as being set up and torn down and generally being frowned upon by the prophetic establishment. But I think it's not alive here. But so yeah, there's definitely this need for a feminine in the divine, even in monotheistic Israel. And there are other places in the Bible where you start seeing this kind of leaking out, or trying to get in, trying to get past what was a pretty thoroughgoing job of kind of thinking. I know that there's a recent dissertation that has been done, if I remember correctly, that believes that takes the position that the J source was in fact did believe that there was a divine feminine, that God had a consort. And I haven't read this definition of this dissertation yet, but I know the guy who wrote it. He's a sharp guy, and he probably will make a good argument. But that's a good question. And we'll encounter Saint Sophia again as we go through. In the meantime, I believe it's the first 9 chapters of Proverbs is pretty much an extended hymn to the virtues of Sophia and the value of going after her with everything in your power to bring her into your life. Now, we talked a little while ago about the problem of retribution and the difficulty that this created by making it really difficult, if not impossible, to envision a circumstance in which the good people are rewarded for their good lives and the wicked are punished for their bad lives. And you have this dilemma that wisdom doesn't always work out. Well, I have an answer for that. And the answer is that is the Platonic doctrine of an immortal soul, finding its way into Judaism not too well during the Hellenistic period. During the time when we're talking about Maccabees, and in Maccabees itself, we see hints of the idea that the soul was separate from the body and constituted a separate existent entity from the body, which is one of the reasons why Maccabees, and for that matter, Wisdom of Solomon, were not put into the canon, because this idea was rejected, certainly by Luther and his supporters. So, but it solves the problem rather neatly, because it puts off the question of judgment and retribution into the next life. Okay, they didn't get what they deserved in this life, but they will in the next. They can speculate that. So, and we'll see that wisdom teaches the imperishable nature of the soul, and this is one of the earliest places where that idea is made explicit. And there are also some other interesting ideas that are considered absolutely commonplace, but no one knows where they originate unless you've read the Wisdom of Solomon. So we'll see some other things like that too. Now, biblical wisdom tradition holds that, as we said, things are supposed to go a certain way, but there's reason for skepticism. The justice of God does not always seem to work out the way it's supposed to. And Ecclesiastes questions the value of wisdom and hard work and securing a good life. It doesn't even really embrace the idea of an afterlife. You go down to Sheol and everything stops, basically, is what happens. Sheol, the Hebrew word for the afterlife, is a place where it's dark, it's cold, it's damp, and nothing happens. It's just kind of It's like it's kind of like daytime television, you know. So, um, you know, it also makes the argument, Ecclesiastes does, that destiny is largely fixed, and there's not a whole lot to do about it. Just try to do what you can. Yes. Yes, that would be. That's. Hey. Stop that. Come on. That's good. So, and yeah, life is to be enjoyed to the extent that you can, that you're able to. Don't overdo it because Ecclesiastes says, yeah, I was a king. I had hundreds of wives, and even that got to be kind of old and after a while. And I had everything that I needed to be absolutely, completely pleasured to death, and it didn't really amount to much. He also points out that the wicked prosper and the righteous don't, or vice versa. There doesn't really seem to be any clear advantage in pursuing righteousness, at least from the standpoint of just someone on earth. Now, let's see. And as we see, and we see all these things here. This is the old wisdom. This is the old biblical wisdom. Solomon's wisdom, the book we're going to be starting tonight, takes a slightly different view. And this is one here. It actually talks about wisdom as being an active agent in the history of Israel, which we have not seen in wisdom literature up to this point. Let's see. Yeah, okay, this new wisdom, of course, reflects the time in which it was written. So it's making certain assumptions that are opposite of Ecclesiastes and other wisdom literature, which we'll run across as we see them. But it's also written during a period of persecution. So the circumstances are different. You don't have the same level of leisure and ease to contemplate things. You're trying to keep yourself in one piece. Keep a whole skin in the process. The objective of the righteousness of righteousness is no longer just to live a good life, but it's to win through to the point that you will get your reward in the afterlife, which is a completely different take on it. It is a totally different way of approaching misfortune and persecution and oppression and all those external pressures that are going to come at you. So wisdom also, I think, especially in the wisdom of Solomon, looked at as having two aspects. With respect to there's human wisdom and there's divine wisdom. Human wisdom, you want perfection of knowledge as it's acted out in your life. Or you might say a well-lived life is evidence of wisdom in action. It's found in righteous persons only. It is only given to those people who earnestly go after it. It gives power to triumph over evil, and it is to be prized above everything else. You know, calling Solomon a wise king is what makes him the greatest king, the gold standard, at least as far as temporal kings and temporal success is concerned. David also is considered to be the best king, but that's for a different reason. That is because, you know, when God told him to straighten up and fly right, he did. No matter what he had just done, or to whom. So, with divine wisdom, we've talked about its personified semi-divine status, its co-eternal nature with God, the fact that it's beside his throne, it knows his thought, it's right there with him all the time. It's an emanation of God's glory. In other words, it's also part of God's being. And this is where we start seeing some early efforts to take this entity who, let's be honest, is acting an awful lot like a goddess, and merging her with God in a way that I think kind of prefigures some of the efforts that were made to craft the doctrine of the Trinity, where you have three in one and one in three and working together and all that sort of thing. And finally, that Sophia makes it possible for God to do pretty much anything. And it's interesting that they are fairly explicit that it's his wisdom or his grasp of wisdom or his access to wisdom, however you want to put it, that makes God God. And this is a rather radical concept, but there it is. Okay, so let's move on to the book itself. The estimated date of composition is not entirely clear. The dates range from about 50 BCE to the time of Gaius Caligula, which was between 37 and 41 CE. There are a number of words in wisdom that are unattested prior to the first century CE, so that I think tends to push the date close into well into the first century. So it's happening roughly about the time that the events of Jesus' life, basically. The author was almost certainly an Alexandrian Jew. It was written in Greek. The book is generally regarded to be the work of a single author. It does not contain bits and pieces from other sources. The person who wrote it knew his Old Testament very, very well, but we don't know his name. In fact, it doesn't even say explicitly, I, Solomon, wrote this. He's not going to that level of pseudepigraphy. But the author makes reference to himself in ways that make it pretty clear that this is who the author is supposed to be. Now, that said, we will find some places in the book where the person of the narrator changes from time to time, but we can deal with that later. The other question, of course, deals with canonicity. And we do find it in the three oldest Greek Old Testament manuscripts. There were several of the church fathers, Cyprian, Ambrose, and some others, who, in spite of there not being a Hebrew text, they accepted the attribution to Solomon. Others, like Eusebius, Origen, and Augustine, they denied that Augustine had written it, and therefore that Solomon had written it, and therefore they denied that it had any kind of authority for matters of doctrine. Jerome also disputed the idea that Solomon was the author, and since he was the one who was basically overseeing the writing of the Vulgate, which was to become the standard edition of the Bible of the Catholic Church, that was that. He changed the name of the book to the Book of Wisdom, dropped Solomon out of the title, and which is why you see both titles. You'll see the Book of Wisdom or Wisdom, and they refer to the same book, the Wisdom of Solomon. It's all the same book, so that can be a little confusing, but that's where that comes from. Let's see, and finally, we can divide the Wisdom of Solomon into several sections, three for the most part. The first one that we're starting tonight is just the reward of being righteous. Why is it a good idea to do the right thing? Then we get an extended praise of wisdom by Solomon, and why wisdom is to be sought after, not simply as a reward. And then, starting in chapter 11, and where you decide where the line of demarcation here is a little vague, but it's pretty much generally in chapter 11, we start to see an interesting kind of rehearsal of events in biblical history, particularly the age of the patriarchs, and culminating in the time of the Exodus, in which the things that are normally ascribed to God as having been done are ascribed to wisdom. Wisdom is responsible for Abraham going off into the desert. Wisdom is responsible for saving Noah and his family from the flood, and so on. And then that goes on at great length with respect to the Exodus, and riffs pretty heavily on the sin of idolatry. Some scholars have seen in this third section what might be the remnant of a Hellenistic Haggadah. Now, a Haggadah, if you ever do a Passover ceremony, there's a little program that everybody gets, and it starts out where the oldest son says, "Father, why is this night different from all of the nights?" And you go through, you rehearse the story of the Exodus, and the Haggadah is a kind of a framework for telling that story. And there have been thousands of different Haggadahs written, and they will often tell the story a little differently, depending on how they, on the circumstances of the people who are involved. I once had the pleasure of working for a rabbi who didn't have a congregation, but he did run an antiquarian book dealership where he specialized in antique Jewish books, ritual objects, and antique Holy Land maps. And on one occasion, he secured a very large private collection of Haggadahs from a guy who had been collecting his whole life. And he showed me a Haggadah from a Jewish colony in Pune, India. God knows how they ended up there. But there they were. And there was this Haggadah where you open it up, and it was a parallel translation. There was Hindi on one side and Hebrew on the other. And then on the facing page, there were these charming illustrations of the Israelites leaving Egypt riding on their elephants. It was just absolutely wonderful. So, I mean, that's just one example. Another example was a handful of Haggadahs that he had acquired that were printed on mimeographs in 1948 in Israel during the War of Independence. And they were bound in cheap construction paper with those little, brass split apart brads that would hold them together. And so they were very, very fragile, really. I mean, after that much time. But you read them, and the story is very different. Now they're relating the story of the Exodus and the Passover to the liberation of Israel and forming it into a new nation and all that sort of thing. So the story changes, as it should, as we would expect it to. So that's what some scholars believe will be happening here, that it incorporates that. When we get there, we'll take a look. We can decide for ourselves if that's really what's going on. And of course, there are other minor divisional arrangements, most of them where to draw the line between the second and third section. So that's really about all we have for that. So what I want to do now is to go to the text. That's not what I want. Now you all know where I got the picture for the slide. There we go. That's better. Okay, so this is the text of the Wisdom of Solomon. If you have yours, follow the bouncing ball. I did. Let's see. Here. Okay. So it starts out, love righteousness, be rulers of the earth. Okay, right away, who's addressed it? The rulers of the earth. It's not addressed to the north, to the average everyday people. Okay, you can see that already. When we're talking about righteousness, um, it's not clear at this point early on, but it will become clear as we move further into the text that um, righteousness here is not just a cardinal virtue of justice. It's this universal moral quality that emerges with the application of wisdom to moral conduct. In the Old Testament, righteousness has an element of justice to it, not in the sense of retributional justice, but in the sense of making things right. You don't, if someone is poor and you give them something so that they won't starve to death or you ease their vulnerability, that's justice. It's not throwing somebody in jail, it's making things right. We're also going to see this idea of righteousness being compared and contrasted with the idea of wickedness. Wickedness is its opposite. That sounds obvious, but in this particular book, it's a very and it's something to keep in mind. Okay, so think of the Lord in goodness and seek Him in sincerity of heart, because He is found by those who do not put Him to the test and manifest Himself to those who do not distrust Him. Tacked a little bit of pushing back here. Maybe yes, Ecclesiastes, who does put God to the test, and Job certainly puts God to the test. This is saying, no, you don't do that. We're not going to do that. And of course, the answer is because we have an answer now for the whole problem of retribution, which we talked about. For perverse thoughts separate people from God, and when His power is tested, it exposes the foolish. So we've, fairly blatant pushback here. Wisdom will not enter a deceitful soul or dwell in a body enslaved to sin. Once again, here's wisdom personified. It's something that can come in and enter you, be part of you. For a holy and disciplined spirit will flee from deceit. Another thing we're going to see here is that the word discipline often appears as a synonym for wisdom. That wisdom involves discipline as much as it involves a certain type of moral conduct. And it's, in fact, some commentators will go so far as to say that it's just another name for wisdom. Whoops. No. Add computer. Okay. Okay. And leave foolish thoughts behind and will be ashamed at the approach of unrighteousness. This idea of the approach of unrighteousness also kind of makes you wonder if unrighteousness is modified here as well, but that might be stretching it a bit. We continue. Wisdom is a kindly spirit, but will not free blasphemers from the guilt of their words, because God is witness of their innermost feelings. And a true observer of their hearts and a hearer of their tongues. Because the Spirit of the Lord has filled the world, and that which holds all things together knows what is said. Therefore, those who utter unrighteous things will not escape notice, and justice, when it punishes, will not pass them by. Do we see also here this idea that Spirit of the Lord filling the world, holds all things together, knows what is said? What does that sound like? Does that maybe hint a little bit towards John 1, the Logos? the same was in the beginning with God, and all things were created by him, and all this sort of thing. We're starting to see a mechanism by which that sort of thing can happen. The idea of logos and Sophia are pretty tightly lodged together. Logos and very easily encompasses the idea of wisdom. Of course, very much, because the word logos kind of encompasses everything. There are literally scores of different definitions for logos during this period, which is what makes it such a challenge to translate books like like the Gospel of John, where it's probably just easiest to render the word logos as logos, because that's probably the best you're going to do. Let's see. So, all right. So, okay. So, verse 9: "For inquiry will be made into the counsels of the ungodly, and the report of their words will come to the Lord to convict them of their lawless deeds. Because a jealous ear hears all things, and the sound of grumbling does not go unheard." So yeah. So there's accountability. There's an accountability here that we don't see in Ecclesiastes, certainly, and there's a certain accountability that Job would kind of like to place on God, but it's not going to happen. And you also see the same thing happening in Jonah, where God does say, okay, go preach to the people in Nineveh. They're going to get wasted in 40 days. And then they repent, and God changes his mind. Where, the whole book of Jonah, up to the point where, poor Jonah gets upchucked out onto the beach, is a study in inevitability. God says something, it will happen. If he has to shove you down the gullet of a fish to make it happen, it's going to happen. And now he says, okay, now go preach. And after all this, God changes his mind and basically makes out Jonah to be a liar. It's essentially what he does, because there's this understanding that if a prophet prophesies something that doesn't happen, he's a false prophet. And God is perfectly willing to throw Jonah under the bus if it means saving the lives of 150,000 or however many thousands of people who have repented in a way that would save their lives. Divine consistency is not it's not all that's cracked up to be. But not here. We're starting to see a little bit of kind of law and order thing that God is justifiably known for in the Old Testament. Beware of their useless grumbling, and keep your tongue from slander, because no secret word is without result, and a lying mouth destroys the soul. That sounds like a proverb, doesn't it? In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it was one word. I didn't have a chance to take a look to see if there's anything corresponding, but I wouldn't surprise me if there is. Yeah, Lewis.
He modified the grumbling useless. Rather, that means there's some grumbling. Not useless. All grumbling is useless. We're taking a ladder. Yeah, all grumbling is useless. That's how my mind.
I would. Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yes. Ooh, frivolous complaints. Oh, okay. Thanks, Jerusalem Bible. I like that. Yeah. Okay. Finding fault. Good. And here's another. Which you start getting a little serious here in verse 12. Do not invite death by the error of your life, or bring destruction by the works of your hands. Now we're talking, if you do the wrong thing, you will endanger yourself at a mortal level. You will endanger yourself. And here's another interesting thing that happens in 13, because God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. This has caused some problems. What do you mean he didn't make death?
Well, that probably went back to the story of Adam and Eve. As long as they played cool in the garden,
Yeah.
you don't get to it. It was totally innocent.
Okay.
In that state, the guy understands.
Yeah, I think
God didn't make death at the beginning. Yeah. He ran and said, "This is my third." But no matter speaking at home,
Now, I'm glad you qualified that because, and I was gonna save this for next week, but I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit because this is kind of cool. You mentioned the snake and you mentioned the devil and the temptation and all that sort of thing. And if you walked into any Christian church in the land, I mean, any church, whether it's Protestant or Catholic or synagogue, or whatever, and you said, Adam and Eve were tempted in the garden by Satan, by the devil. No one would argue with you. No one would argue with you at all. But go from one end of the Old Testament to the other, and you will not find a single verse that explicitly ties Satan or the devil with that serpent. There is nothing in there that makes that connection. The first place we see it is here in the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 24, but through the devil's envy, death enters the world. This is the first reference that gives us that explicit connection that everybody assumes, but most people don't know where it comes from. God did not bring death into the world. It's that whole idea that death is the result of not doing the right thing, not doing, being wise. Yeah.
Physical death or spiritual death?
Are we talking physical death or spiritual death? The answer is yes. I think primarily we're talking spiritual, because we now have this immortal soul thing to fall back on, which changes the whole definition of death from what it was in Old Testament, where things really, where it really was deadly, and there wasn't really anything left at all. But with this new model, things are different. You have you don't have the same that you would before. Now, that's not to say that physical death isn't. I think there are places where clearly it is. And there's a certain pleasure that the author takes in the prospect that the people who are not wise, the people who revile those who do seek after wisdom, are so going to get there when the time comes. Okay, so let's overcompensate a little bit here. Whoops. Okay, here we go. For he created all things so that they might exist. The generative forces of the world are wholesome. There is no destructive poison in them, and the dominion of Hades is not on earth, for righteousness is immortal. This is another new thing that we see. Some of the earliest manifestations of it are in the Wisdom of Solomon, and that is the idea that righteousness can be a conduit to immortality. This is another fairly new concept. Yeah.
Also, looking for some vision of righteousness.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, oh, that's right.
I mean,
No, that's a very good point. The comment was that righteousness is being personified here. It's being described as something that is immortal, which implies that unless you say so, well, it's an entity of some kind, and it happens to be an immortal entity, as it is here. And we also actually we kind of see more personification. The ungodly by their words and deeds summoned death, considering him a friend. They pined away and made a covenant because they are fit to belong in his company. Well, that's different. We don't see anything like that in the Old Testament. That's a totally different idea that death is personified as an entity as well. Yes. I think most of this is theological. We'll get a clearer picture of it as we go into it. But there does seem to be at least a consistent idea that yeah, there is actually something theological done. It would be consistent with what we've seen in the past. For example, we know that during the Intertestamental Period, as a result mainly of Zoroastrian influence, Judaism picked up a whole lot of interest in angels and demons and their operations and what they did, how they were organized, how the ethereal, the celestial, or the infernal bureaucracies were set up. Arguably, all bureaucracies are infernal, but in this case, it would only make sense for them to construct characters to fill those roles. And I also find it interesting here that they're in a covenant with death. What on earth would that be about? Maybe, yeah, maybe the idea being that, yeah, like with there are the old stories of Nimrod, the mighty hunter um, whose covenant, who used to be a very righteous person, but then developed the model that he could gain power by turning the bow that he had used to hunt animals to start hunting people, and create military empires that way. And in effect, he's making a covenant with death, I suppose, in a very general, abstract sense. The idea that someone else's death, someone else's loss is your gain. I don't know. Kind of Faustian, yeah, very, very much so. Maybe even worse, because instead of your soul, you're selling someone else's. If in fact that's what they mean by death. It also says they find it. So it could very easily mean that they're talking about, in exchange for something else, they're willing to sacrifice some part of themselves that lends them some kind of spiritual life or intellectual life or both. Lewis.
We got on Broadway, the first guy sells his soul. So that Washington senators and independent. Yankees always won the family. So I think that's the basis of the story.
The story, yeah.
It's about story. It's this story.
Yeah. Well, and we eventually end up with the question: what will one give in exchange for his soul? Well, let me think about it. So, what if they'd be discussing during election year? Okay. I wasn't planning on going into chapter 2, but let's go ahead and start nibbling in there a little bit too. So this might be a little bit disjointed. No more than usual, I hope. This is they reasoned unsoundly. I think we're still talking about the wicked people because they're not sound reason. Short and sorrowful is a life. There is no remedy when a life comes to its end. No one has been able to return tense, and hereafter we shall be as though we had never been. This is sounding a lot like Ecclesiastes, because that's kind of what he's saying. He's just putting a slightly different emphasis on it, not as an excuse to go and absolutely run riot, but at the same time, there is the sense that you are to appreciate the fact that life is short and try to enjoy it as best you can. Maybe not as most of you can. The breath in our nostrils is smoke, and reason is a spark kindled by the beating of our hearts. When it is extinguished, the body will turn to ashes, and the spirit will dissolve like empty air. Okay, so this is an attitude that does not hold to the idea of an existence so laughable. They're using this is no time like the present. The present is the only time, so we have to make best use of it we can. Our name will be forgotten in time. No one will remember our works. Our life will pass away like the traces of a cloud and be scattered like mist that is chased by the rays of the sun and overcome by its heat. Once again, this is sounding a lot like Ecclesiastes. For our allotted time is the passing of a shadow, and there is no return from death, because it is sealed up and no one turns back. So we can see that there are two conflicting philosophies here, and they really hinge on the question of, is there anything after death? Wisdom of Solomon says, yes, there is, as we'll find out. These guys say, no, there isn't. And it's that afterlife that gives you the license to say, yes, there is something worth persevering for, even in the face of very bad things, because it will all be better eventually in the hereafter. Then we hear, come therefore, let us enjoy the good things that exist and make use of the creation to full as in youth. Let us take our fill of costly wine and perfumes. Let no flower of spring pass us by. Let us crown ourselves with rosebuds before they wither. Let none of us fail to share in our revelry. Everywhere let us leave signs of enjoyment, because this is our portion and this is our lot. That last bit almost word for word. And then, of course, it gets worse, where it says, let us oppress the righteous poor man, let us not spare the widow, or regard the gray hairs of the aged, but let our might be our law of right, and what is weak proves itself might make right. So, oh, that's harsh. And now we're going to get some details. Okay. Let us lie in wait for the righteous man, because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our action. He reproaches us for our sins against the law. He accuses us of sins against our training. He professes to have knowledge of God and calls himself a child of the Lord. I don't know that child of God shows up in the Old Testament much either. I'm reasonably sure that it does not. Certainly not in this context. I'm sorry? Servant. Okay. Yeah. I'd have to check the Greek, but yeah. Well, now wait a minute. Do you can't the word child also mean a servant? In Greek, it can. Yeah. Okay. Boy. Boy. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Got it. Okay. Let's see. He has become a reproof to our thoughts, The very sight of him is a burden to us because his manner of life is unlike that of others. I believe the word we're looking for is buzzkill. And his ways are strange. I love that. We are considered by him as something base, and he avoids our ways as unclean. He calls the last end of the righteous happy and boasts that God of his Father is his Father. Let us see if his words are true, and let us test what will happen at the end of his life. For if the righteous man is God's child, he will help him and will deliver him from the hand of his adversaries. Let us test him with insult and torture, so that we may find out how gentle he is and make trial of his forbearance. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to what he says, he will be protected. Okay, now this is the Job Ecclesiastes. Job Ecclesiastes, either of them heard this, they'd kind of just say, tough luck, fella, you're about to get smoked, You're not going to get saved. No one's going to intervene for you because that's the way the world is. Even though wisdom says one thing, the real world says it's going to be something else. You can see where this is going. I mean, Wisdom of Solomon is arguing that's not the case. And the fact that this is being written in a period of persecution. Now, when I say persecution, you have to kind of qualify that just a little bit. We're talking about the Roman occupation. Okay, so it's not like the period of the Maccabees, but the Romans were not, they weren't exactly benign, even though, to be fair, they really did do a lot of things that they didn't necessarily have to do in order to keep the Jewish people from rebelling over it. The problem was it was really hard to keep the Jewish people from rebelling all the time, no matter what you did, because it was just a very unstable region, and rebellions and uprisings were everywhere and happening all the time. Josephus lists many rebels and messianic pretenders and adventurers who rose up in an attempt to throw off the Romans, and all of them very, very badly, and usually took down quite a few other followers with them. So, and this, in fact, is another reason why the Jewish people, the rabbinical tradition, tended to shy away from some of the intertestamental period. Now, this is wisdom literature, but this idea that God will deliver you from physical oppression is also a theme that we've seen in apocalyptic literature. We've seen that there, and that didn't always happen. The apocalyptic literature led the Jewish people into some very ill-advised wars, very horrible results. So what happens? Well, then we go down here. Thus they reasoned, but they were led astray, for their wickedness blinded them, and they did not know the secret purposes of God, nor hoped for the wages of holiness, nor discerned the prize for blameless souls. They didn't realize what possibilities lay in pursuing wisdom, pursuing that kind of life, as a part for what they've done. For God created us in incorruption and made us in the image of his own eternity. And if I had gone ahead, I would have looked up what that word eternity is in the Greek, because I would be curious to know exactly what that is. But we've also seen verse 24 we just looked at. Oh, yes. Oh, okay. God created human beings to be immortal. That in the image of his own eternity, right?
I remember in Ecclesiastes also, where it said God has put opportunity in men's hearts. Almost like a parent.
Yeah.
This is what you want. They don't actually promise you Ecclesiastes that you get it.
Yeah, but you're wrong.
This is what you want.
Yeah. Lewis. Nature. Huh. Okay. That's it. Okay,
The
so.
OED has 350 entries for nature. I had to do that once.
Oh. Okay.
Nature's a big one.
Yeah, okay. That's a word study. Yeah. Oh, New Jerusalem also uses nature. Okay. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Okay. Well, I'm glad you guys are following along because that helps. Yeah. So but the devil's envy, but through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his company experience. Okay, I think we'll stop there, even though we've got plenty of time. This is just kind of a good stopping point, and it'll give us a chance to kind of go back. What I'll do is, per usual, I'll get the slides up in the PDF and post them so that you guys can download them, and I'll also make them available if I can get this broadcast to work the way it's supposed to. We have an audio track, so I'll probably end up doing is just splicing in the slides as we go. But are there any questions at this point?
No.
Oh, yeah.
References to the devil and demons.
Devil and
Where history for those concepts.
Oh, okay. So the devil, where the devil, and we're not talking about the Old Testament Satan, where this is more the, the more Jack Nicholson on cocaine in the case of Red Bull kind of devil, that kind of devil. And to tell you the truth, I don't know exactly when that comes in. It does. That devil looks an awful lot like the Zoroastrian evil presence Ahriman, who is kind of the counterpart to the good, benevolent god Ahura Mazda. And Ahriman also is unique in that he is not created. He's not a creature of Ahura Mazda. He's self-existent. The two of them do not depend on each other for their existence, and we see a little bit of that if we assume it. I think we can that Ahriman is influencing the idea of the devil in Christianity and Judaism. This kind of semi-independent nature that he has a remarkable amount of latitude in what he's allowed to do in terms of going after the righteous and directing his legions of demons and all that sort of thing. That's about the best I can do. So right about that. So okay, if we're talking about that, we're talking about somewhere in the 500s BCE would be when that influence starts to come in with the rise of Persia. When we see a full-blown devil in Judaism, I have to look that up. I'm not really sure, but yeah, Hades is basically synonymous with Sheol. Now the Greek Hades, it's not quite the same. I mean, people are still aware to some extent, aren't they? I guess.
Yeah, it depends on what is region.
Yeah. There's some awareness. I mean, like for example, Odysseus in Book 11 of the Odyssey, he can go and make a sacrifice and call up the shade of Tiresias and talk to him. And I guess there are some other examples of things like that where it's possible to communicate with people in the other afterworld, and things are happening there. But and of course there are also things like, I guess, the Fields? Is that the place where the heroes go? Or, you know?
Probably ancestry.
Yeah, kind of an ancestor Kevin. Yeah, exactly. So, yes.
You talk about the modern influences. This was underground in the harbor and out in the Russian. Why are you
there almost certainly is, and that's an excellent question because I haven't really seen. I can't say that I've really seen a whole lot of people who are scholarly works that try to tie Egyptian religion in with Judeo-Christian stuff, with one exception, and that is in iconography, the image of the Madonna and Child appears to have been taken almost directly from the Egyptian iconography of Isis and Osiris. There's apparently some iconographic connection there. I'm vague on exactly what that is, but there's apparently some tie over there. But that's all I got. It's a good question, and I'd love to know the answer.
Mother Child, the universal theme is the Eastern, Western, South American.
Oh, sure.
Pre-Columbian, it's just everything. So, in fact, maybe they saw the Egyptian formation.
Well, they did, and also Osiris is a god who dies and resurrects, which is another important thing. And he also is instrumental in leading through the underworld and into, the happy place, into the afterlife. Right. Gets them past the judgment scene and all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, the parallels are fairly close in a salvific kind of way, as well as just the idea of mother and child. Any other questions? Okay, well then we'll go ahead and wrap that up for tonight, and I will let you know how this thing turns out, and give you an update on where you can find us. And if this works, we'll try it again. Even if it doesn't, I think we ought to try it 1 or 2 more times. Usually get it right. All right, thank you.